Hey folks, since I'm gone on Thursday, October 5th, pre recording a lecture here for all you people, both online and in person. And I figured what I want to talk about today, which I thought would be a good topic actually for a day that I'm gone, is four mallet playing methods. Okay, so I'm sure you've all seen this at some point, either from members of our percussion studio here or online or in high school or at a marching band competition, etc. You've probably seen percussionists hold four mallets. I wasn't totally sure how much time I wanted to spend on this topic. In the past, I've spent a little more time on it, but I think especially trying to be realistic about what you're going to be dealing with as educators. Um, it's not something that you necessarily need to know all the ins and outs of as a band director for a junior high or high school. Typically, it's more of an advanced level thing, so it's not going to be coming up all the time. However, I thought it would be interesting and useful for you to know a little bit of background and how the different techniques work. So I'm going to go through some of that. Um, So first of all, just a little background. The four mallet technique is something that primarily gets used on marimba and vibraphone, although increasingly we see it get used on other instruments as well. So there are certainly some occasions when it gets used on xylophone or even glockenspiel, but typically it gets associated with marimba and vibraphone. There's some modern applications and some historical. So to give you just a tiny bit of background, um, we're pretty sure, as far as research shows, that probably where a lot of this technique comes from, holding four mallets, two in each hand at the same time, is from the Guatemalan marimba tradition. So there's a really rich history of Guatemalans forming marimba bands going back to at least the 1800s, and so there's some evidence of marimbas in these ensembles. Certainly, the bass players holding two mallets in their left hand, so that they could play chord progressions, and then later on them adding a fourth mallet, so we had four sticks. Around the turn of the 20th century, the instruments like marimba and vibraphone were starting to get um, while marimba was starting to be turned into a western instrument. The xylophone was actually pretty popular, especially for ragtime use, and then vibraphone gets invented in the early 20th century, primarily to be used as a jazz instrument. So you have sort of a development of the instruments themselves, especially in the U.S. and in Europe. And it wasn't so much used in classical music, but more ragtime, jazz, and at that point there would have been a lot of occasions in which people played transcriptions of popular music, which in a lot of that popular music was jazz and ragtime and Tin Pan Alley tunes, that sort of thing. So we see American and European marimbas in particular start to hold three and four sticks or mallets in their hands and start to learn this technique. We're pretty sure that they basically copied it from Guatemalans they met, who were performing in various places. So just kind of some interesting history. Um, in terms of the early marimba stuff, um, the technique was pretty minimal. So a lot of what they were doing, there wasn't a lot of independence. In other words, they weren't super flexible with what they were doing, but it was just a lot of chance to play either chords, like pretty simple block chords, or then eventually use some sort of like chord and accompaniment. So maybe you have some sort of two note chord happening in one hand and something a little more melodic happening in the other hand. Of course, people start to develop more and more intricate techniques and start to expand what you can do with it. So by the mid 20th century, or even by the 30s and 40s, you had like marimba concerti, you had people playing transcriptions of more complicated music from maybe the Romantic era or the Baroque era or classical era. Doing some solo marimba concerts, but still typically pretty much all transcriptions or maybe stuff that was written by the marimbas themselves. And then in jazz, of course, you have jazz vibraphone is starting to become really serious. Band leaders, soloists, sidemen in various bands, like Milt Jackson would be a really famous example, or Lionel Hampton a little bit later. Fast forward a little bit into the 60s and 70s, and that's really where a lot of the techniques developed that are kind of still present today. So still the main things we tend to use today as percussionists in the 2020s. So this comes from a few folks. There's a very, very important marimbist named Keiko Abe. She's still alive. I think she's about 90-something right now. Let's check real quick. Keiko Abe. Okay, she's 86. Sorry, Keiko, I aged you a couple of years. So Keiko Abe is a Japanese marimbist who really was credited with helping turn the marimba into a super serious solo instrument, sort of in the 1960s and 70s. So she did a couple things. One is she commissioned a lot of music for the instrument. So she was asking composers to write solo music. A lot of that music still gets played. She also helped expand the instrument to the 5-octave marimba, which is kind of standard today as far as serious like solo instruments go. So the nice marimba that we have in our band room is a 5-octave marimba. That's not something that you would have necessarily seen, especially manufactured by like a big American company before the 1970s or so, and it really wasn't totally popularized until a few decades later. So takes a while, obviously, to catch up. So Keiko had a huge impact on marimba playing, and she just was essentially more virtuosic and had more command of the instrument and of the playing techniques than almost anyone before her. There's some other important marimbas from around this time too. Lee Howard Stevens was an American marimbist, which we'll talk about him a little bit. He taught at Northwestern for many years, and there's a grip named after him. And then the other person who's maybe relevant to know is Gary Burton, who's also a still living jazz vibraphonist who made huge strides with technique as well, kind of in the jazz world, but they transfer over to really all sorts of playing. Anyway, so there's a little historical background. Let's talk about the grips. There's essentially 3 main grips that percussionists use to play with 4 mallets. Okay, and I'm going to talk in detail about 2 of them and then just touch on the third, and we'll figure out what makes the most sense in terms of, and you should be able to see what I'm doing. I'll play at an instrument a little bit later, but just want to hold them for now, or sit right now. Okay, so grip number 1 looks something like this. This is called traditional grip. Okay, some people call it Japanese traditional, although I think that's a bit of a misnomer because it didn't necessarily, it wasn't necessarily invented by Japanese marimbas, although I think the reason that name stuck is because Keiko Abe uses this grip, and so it was very much associated with her. Okay. This is called, people will sometimes also say cross grip, and that's because the sticks themselves are crossed. Okay, so the back of the sticks actually touch one another. Cross grip. It's hard for me to move the mallets, and then it's a mirror image. Okay, so the defining characteristic of this is that the first mallet is being held between our index finger and our middle finger. Okay, and then down on the bottom it's held by our ring finger and pinky. The other mallet actually slides behind, so kind of hard to see, but behind. So it's actually closer to our palm. It goes out the side, and our thumb is kind of in control of it. So this grip looks something like this. And I'll stand up here in a second and reorient so you guys can see better. Holding all 4 mallets looks something like this. Traditional grip. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit how we move the sticks in a second when we get to the instrument. Okay, second grip. So that's traditional. It's pretty much associated with marimba playing mostly, but you can use it on anything. One thing I just want to talk about with the 3 main grips, there's sometimes kind of a misconception that certain grips are more for marimba versus for vibraphone. That's not really true. Those associations mostly just have to do with who historically basically invented these grips and performed with them, but all the grips work equally as well, in my opinion, on any instrument, as long as you put in the time. Okay, this grip is called Stevens grip, Lee Howard Stevens, who I mentioned a minute ago. This is probably the most popular technique in the United States. I find when you go abroad that there's a little bit more variety in who does what. But especially when I was coming up, I did not play Stevens. I played traditional because that's what my teacher taught me when I was in high school, and a lot of people thought that was very weird. Stevens is still very, very much the dominant grip in the United States. Makes sense. It was invented by an American who's a really famous marimbist. I think the other reason this grip sort of became the dominant grip is because, for the most part, it became the grip people use in marching band and DCI activities, drum corps activities. So I think that helped kind of establish it as the dominant grip. Okay, so this grip, you'll notice, looks pretty different. The sticks do not actually physically touch each other. So some people also will call it an independent grip versus a cross grip. Right, so the last grip we looked at was a cross grip, or it's called traditional, but it is a cross grip, an example of a cross grip, because the sticks cross each other. This is an example of an independent grip. Okay, so in this grip, basically your pinky and ring finger are holding one stick by themselves, and your other three fingers are holding the other stick. You put it in the palm of your hand, and you wrap those fingers around, and all of the movement pretty much comes from these inner fingers. So when you're playing, you don't really want to move this mallet for the most part. It's of course going to move a little bit because it's hanging out there in the air, but as far as like when you're moving the stick, you're pretty much only moving one stick. Stevens grip, independent grip. The last grip, which I'll talk about the least, not because it's not a worthwhile grip, but just because I actually don't play this grip really at all, is Burton. So you might notice it looks quite similar to the cross grip. That's because, or the traditional grip. That's because okay, now I'm just holding it because I want to go back to what I naturally do. This is Burton grip, named after Gary Burton, the jazz vibraphonist. So it's another cross grip, and this one's, the sticks are crossed over one another. Okay. But whereas in traditional, this mallet is on the inside, now it's on the outside, and oops, just threw a stick. I'm sure you're all laughing. The mechanism to move it is just a little bit different. Okay. So again, this grip gets associated more with jazz vibraphone because Gary Burton's a super famous jazz vibraphonist. But I know some really, really amazing percussionists who use this grip on playing marimba, solo marimbas, etc. So it's a good grip for anything. These grips have advantages and disadvantages. And I think maybe now I'm going to shift over so you can see me at an instrument, and we can talk through some of how this actually works. Some of this actually works. So give me 1 second. I need to reorient. Okay, and we're just going to do it on vibraphone in here, because that's what I have in my office. Okay, and we're going to hope that this mic picks up things at a good volume. Okay, so let's show the grips again real quick. So this is cross grip, traditional grip. Okay. And to see this in action, I'll just move this mic a little bit like this. Trying to see in the camera what's a good angle. Okay. So the action to move the sticks comes from basically an outer wrist action and then an inner wrist action. We tend to number our sticks when we're dealing with four mallets from 1, 2, 3 to 4. Okay, so like we talk about stickings a lot with left and right. When we're dealing with four mallets, we talk about stickings in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4 because we have 4 sticks instead of 2. Okay, so our leftmost mallet, our bass mallet, is 1, and our highest mallet is 4. We call 1 and 4 our outer mallets, and 2 and 3 our inner mallets, and that's because they're on the inside versus the outside. Okay, so especially if you're playing something like a scale run or something, you tend to use your 2 inner mallets. Most people would, some people don't, but most people would. Right, and so you don't necessarily need to use all 4 mallets to do any passage. So what is the advantage of having 4 mallets? Well, obviously, the biggest one is you can do chords, right? So I can play an F major chord. I can play a B flat major chord. Whatever. Okay, I can also do some amount of melody and accompaniment. Okay, something like that. I'm just making some stuff up. You can also do things like arpeggios, obviously. I don't really know what that was, but just showing some independence. You could technically do what I just did with 2 mallets, but it'd be much more difficult. You can also do something like spread notes out over a much bigger spread or range of the instrument, you know. Have something down very low. Easier to accomplish. And then there's other things like we can, you know, do a moving sort of bass line type of thing. You know, while there's also a melody happening in the right hand. I don't know. Something like that. Right? Okay, so those are some examples of some things we do with 4 mallets with any grip, but I'm specifically using traditional grip right now. So with Stevens grip, I'm switching the grip now, right? I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and the action from this is essentially kind of a rotational stroke for our number 1 mallet. Turning the whole arm inwards for our second mallet, and then inverse with 3 and 4. So one advantage of this grip, and one reason people like it, is because it's easier to have a large interval size. So it's quite easy to do an octave with this grip. Whereas it might be a little more challenging with my grip, traditional grip. I will say that I don't really find it that challenging to do an octave, especially on something like a vibraphone. But it certainly, I do acknowledge you can physically hold the mallets further apart, get a bigger interval, so I just played a 10th or whatever, and that wasn't really a problem. It's harder for me to do with cross grip, traditional grip. See, I missed it. Okay, so that is one just clear advantage. The other thing people tend to say is that it's easier to change your interval size when you're playing with Stevens, right? So because the inner mallets are totally independent, you can go from here to here very quickly. Technically that's true. Practically speaking, I don't find it to be that much of an issue for most people. You have to work on your interval, changing your interval sizes no matter what grip you use. And so it just takes practice. It might be a little bit easier initially with Stevens, but I think in the long run, you know, you can do it quite well with any of the grips. And then Burton, which like I said, I don't play at all, so I'm not gonna try to show you too much, but it's gonna look something like this. Okay. The one thing I'll say is a little bit different with Burton is people tend to use their number 4 mallet more as the melodic mallet and do chords with 1, 2, and 3, which is a little bit unusual, but I think again that comes from it kind of having more of a jazz background where the vibraphonist is maybe playing some sort of, you know, harmonic accompaniment while doing some sort of jazzy melody in their outer mallet. Okay, just two more quick things to talk about. One is that depending on the instrument, just like as we talk about in normal class with two mallets, right? We have different mallets. So right now I'm using 4 totally matched mallets. They're all the same level of hardness. Okay. But sometimes when we're dealing with 4 sticks, people use what's called graduated mallets. Okay, and I don't know how well you'll be able to tell this via the video, and you can't see super well, but the colors of my mallets, sorry, that was probably really loud. The colors of my mallets are, the tops of my mallets are a little bit different. So the main wrap is blue, but there's like a stitching on the top that is different. And that shows me how hard each one is. So my softest mallet would be in the bass, and my hardest mallet would be in the, I guess you could call it the soprano, if you want to think about it as like SATB, right? And my middle two are actually the same level of hardness. So in the case, especially where we really want melody and accompaniment to be clear, some people really like using graduated sets, also because it's easier to get a nice warmer bass tone at the bottom of an instrument with a softer mallet, and it's easier to bring out those high pitches or those melodic pitches with a harder mallet. Okay, and then the other thing I just want to talk about real quickly is rolls. Okay, so unfortunately, vibes are kind of a bad instrument to demonstrate this on because we typically don't do 4 mallet rolls on vibraphone. It's much more of a marimba thing, but there's essentially a couple kinds of rolls I want to talk about just real quickly on marimba, or with 4 mallets. So one is that sometimes we just have a roll on a single pitch, just like we do with 2 mallets, and we essentially execute it the exact same way. Right, a single stroke roll between our 2 inner mallets. Okay, or I guess you could technically do it with any combination of 2 mallets, but people almost always do mallets 2 and 3, the middle 2 mallets. You might also see like a chorale on marimba where you have, a stack of chords that are supposed to be rolled. So usually how we would execute that is basically just going back and forth, hand to hand, double stops. So we have our left hand playing 2 notes at one time and our right hand maybe playing 2 notes at one time. Or if there's only 3 notes in the chord, it'd be 1 and 2 or 2 and 1, depending on the pitches. So like a F major chord would maybe be, again, kind of sounds weird on vibraphone. It's something we generally do on marimba, not vibes, but if you actually held the pedal down, it would be. Going back and forth. We call this a hand-to-hand roll. Computer's closing. Okay. It's the most commonly used roll, I would say, if we need to roll 4 notes. Basically, the only other option we have that some people like to do, although I find that this roll has kind of fallen out of fashion, is what we call a ripple roll. And that's where we have, in a way, what we're doing is making our mallets play flams between the hand, right? So sorry if this is harsh on the microphone, but so I'm basically treating it like a hand-to-hand roll, but because I'm letting my mallet sort of be floppy and do a flam, they're actually happening at different times, so it kind of sounds more like there's more to it. So that's what we call it, a ripple roll. This roll is mostly just used with Stevens grip because it's easiest to do. Although you can do it with other grips. You can do it with traditional. But admittedly, it's a little more awkward. is usually the time when I ask what questions you have and figure out what I forgot, but we're on a video online, so I think we're going to leave it at that. I hope you found this interesting. Again, I know you're probably not going to be necessarily teaching a formal grip anytime soon, and maybe for some of you it will never be part of the job that you have, but it's still important to know a little bit about these grips, how they work, what we use them for, and I think it's interesting to know a little history. So I hope you found that interesting as well. Yep, so just to recap, 3 main grips: traditional, Stevens, Burton. Advantages and disadvantages. There are advantages and disadvantages to each. You can be a really good player with any of the 3 of them, and we use it for chords, for melody accompaniment, for more intricate passages around the keyboard, for maybe being able to play over a wider spread of notes. And I think that's it. Thank you. I'll see you guys all soon.